Everyone for coming. We're here to hear George Soros. He doesn't need an introduction. Let me just say that tonight's remarks are on the record. If you look at the cards on your table, you'll see an email address to which you can email your questions. So when George has finished his remarks, we'll take some of your questions in that way. And with that, George.
So thank you all for listening to me. It has become something of an annual Davos tradition for me to give an overview of the current state of the world. I was planning half an hour for my remarks and another half hour for questions, but my speech has turned out to be closer to an hour. I attribute it to the severity of the problems confronting us today. After I finished, I'll open it up for your questions, so please be prepared. I find the current moment in history rather painful. Open societies are in crisis, and various forms of dictatorships and mafia states, exemplified by Putin's Russia, are on the rise. In the United States, President Trump would like to establish a mafia state, but can't, because the Constitution, the institutions, and a vibrant civil society won't allow it. Whether we like it or not, my foundations, most of our grantees, and myself personally are fighting an uphill battle, protecting the democratic achievements of the past. My foundations used to focus on the so-called developing world, but now that the open society is also endangered in the United States and Europe, we are spending more than half our budget closer to home, because what is happening here is having a negative impact on the whole world. By protecting the democratic achievements of the past is not enough. We must also safeguard the values of open society so that they will be better able to withstand future onslaughts. Open society will always have its enemies, and each generation has to reaffirm its commitment to open society for it to survive. The best defense is a principled counterattack. The enemies of open society feel victorious, and this induces them to push their repressive efforts too far. And this generates a resentment and offers opportunities to push back. That's what's happening in places like Hungary today. I used to define the goals of my foundations as defending open societies from their enemies, making governments accountable, and fostering a critical mode of thinking. But the situation has deteriorated. Not only the survival of open society, but the survival of our entire civilization is at stake. The rise of leaders such as Kim Jong-un in North Korea and Donald Trump in the United States have much to do with this. Both seem to be willing to risk a nuclear war in order to keep themselves in power. But the root cause goes even deeper. Mankind's ability to harness the forces of nature, both for constructive and destructive purposes, continues to grow, while our ability to govern ourselves properly fluctuates and is now at a low ebb. The threat of nuclear war is so horrendous that we are inclined to ignore it. But it's real. Indeed, the United States is set on a course towards nuclear war by refusing to accept that North Korea has become a nuclear power. This creates a strong incentive for North Korea to develop its nuclear capacity with all possible speed, which in turn may induce the United States to use its nuclear superiority preemptively, in effect, to start a nuclear war in order to prevent a nuclear war, an obviously self-contradictory strategy. The fact is, North Korea has become a nuclear power, and there is no military action that can prevent what has already happened. The only sensible strategy is to accept reality, however unpleasant it is, and to come to terms with North Korea as a nuclear power. This requires the United States to cooperate with all the interested parties, China foremost among them. Beijing holds most of the levers of power against North Korea, but is reluctant to use them. If it came down too hard on Pyongyang, the regime could collapse and China would be flooded by North Korean refugees. What's more, Beijing is reluctant to do any favors for the United States, South Korea, or Japan, against each of which it harbors a variety of grudges. Achieving cooperation will require extensive negotiations, but once it's attained, the alliance would be able to confront North Korea with both carrots and sticks. The sticks could be used to force it to enter negotiations, and the carrots to reward it for verifiably suspending further development of nuclear weapons. The sooner a so-called freeze-for-freeze agreement can be reached, the more successful the policy will be. Success can be measured by the amount of time it would take North Korea to make its nuclear arsenal fully operational. I'd like to draw your attention to two seminal reports just published by Crisis Group on the prospects of a nuclear war in North Korea. The other major threat to the survival of our civilization is climate change, which is also a growing cause of forced migration. I have dealt with the problems of migration at great lengths elsewhere, but I must emphasize how severe and intractable those problems are. I don't want to go into details on climate change either, because we know what needs to be done. We have the scientific knowledge. It's the political will that is missing, particularly in the Trump administration. Clearly, I consider the Trump administration a danger to the world, but I regard it as a purely temporary phenomenon that will disappear in 2020 or even sooner. I give President Trump credit for motivating his core supporters brilliantly, but for every core supporter, he has created a greater number of core opponents who are equally strongly motivated. That's why I expect a Democratic landslide in 2018. My personal goal in the United States is to help re-establish a functioning two-party system. This will require not only a landslide in 2018, but also a Democratic Party that will aim at a non-partisan redistricting, the appointment of well-qualified judges, a properly conducted census, and other measures that a functioning two-party system requires. I want to spend the bulk of my remaining time on another global problem, the rise and monopolistic behavior of the giant IT platform companies. These companies have often played an innovative and liberating role, but as Facebook and Google have grown into ever more powerful monopolies, they have become obstacles to innovation, and they have caused a variety of problems of which we are only now beginning to become aware. Companies earn their profits by exploiting their environment. Mining and oil companies exploit the physical environment. So social media companies exploit the social environment. This is particularly nefarious because social media companies influence how people think and behave without them even being aware of it. This has far-reaching adverse consequences on the functioning of democracy, particularly on the integrity of elections. The distinguishing feature of internet platforms is that they are networks and they enjoy rising or marginal returns, and that accounts for the phenomenal growth. The network effect is truly unprecedented and transformative, but it's also unsustainable. It took Facebook 8.5 years to reach the first billion users, and half that time to reach the second billion. At this rate, Facebook will run out of people to convert in less than 3 years. Facebook and Google effectively control over half of all internet advertising revenue. To maintain their dominance, they must expand their networks and increase their share of the user's attention. Currently, they do this by providing users with a convenient platform. The more time users spend on the platform, the more valuable they become to the companies. Content providers also contribute to the profitability of social media companies because they can't avoid using the platform, and they have to accept whatever terms they are offered. The exceptional profitability of these companies is largely a function of their avoiding responsibility for and avoid paying for the content of their platforms. They claim that they are merely distributing information, but the fact that they are near monopoly distributors make them into public utilities and should subject them to more stringent regulations aimed at preserving competition, innovation, and fair and open universal access. The business model of social media companies is based on advertising. Their true customers are the advertisers. But gradually, a new business model is emerging based not only on advertising, but on selling products and services directly to users. They exploit the data they control, bundle the services they offer, and use discriminatory pricing to keep for themselves most of the benefits that otherwise they would have to share with consumers. This enhances their profitability, but even further. But the bundling of services and discriminatory pricing undermine the efficiency of the market economy. Social media companies deceive their users by manipulating their attention and directing it towards their own commercial purposes. They deliberately engineer addiction to the services they provide. This can be very harmful, particularly for adolescents. There is a similarity between internet platforms and gambling companies. Casinos have developed techniques to hook gamblers to the point where they gamble away all their money, even money they don't have. Something very harmful and maybe irreversible is happening to human attention in our digital age. Not just distraction and addiction. Social media companies are inducing people to give up their autonomy. The power to shape people's attention is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few companies. It takes a real effort to assert and defend what John Stuart Mill called the freedom of mind. There is a possibility that once lost, people who grow up in the digital age will have difficulty in regaining it. This may have far-reaching political consequences. People without the freedom of mind can be easily manipulated. This danger doesn't loom only in the future. It's already played an important role in the 2018 US presidential elections. But there is an even more alarming prospect on the horizon. There could be an alliance between authoritarian states and these large, data-rich IT monopolies that would bring together nascent systems of corporate surveillance with an already developed system of state-sponsored surveillance. They may even result in a web of totalitarian control, the likes of which not even Aldous Huxley or George Orwell could have imagined. The countries in which such unholy marriages are likely to occur first are in Russia and China. The Chinese IT companies in particular are fully equal to the American ones. They also enjoy the full support and protection of the Xi Jinping regime. The government of China is strong enough to protect its national champions, at least within its borders. US-based IT monopolies are already tempted to compromise themselves in order to gain entrance to this vast and fast-growing market. The dictatorial leaders in these countries may be only too happy to collaborate with them, since they want to improve their own methods of control over their own populations and expand their power and influence in the United States and the rest of the world. The owners of the platform giants consider themselves the masters of the universe, but in fact they are slaves to preserving their dominant position. It's only a matter of time before the global dominance of the US IT monopolies is broken. Davos is a good place to announce that their days are numbered. Regulation and taxation will be their undoing, and EU Competition Commissioner Vestager will be their nemesis. There is a growing recognition of a connection between the dominance of the platform monopolies and the rising level of inequality. The concentration of share ownership in the hands of private individuals plays some role, but the peculiar position occupied by the IT giants is even more important. They have achieved monopoly power, but at the same time, they are also competing against each other. They are big enough to swallow startups that could become into competitors, but only the giants have the resources to invade each other's territory. They are poised to dominate the new growth areas that artificial intelligence is opening up, like driverless cars. The impact of innovations on unemployment depends on government policies. The European Union and particularly the Nordic countries, are far more far-sighted in their social policies than the United States. They protect the workers, not the jobs. They are willing to pay for retraining or retiring displaced workers. This gives workers of the Nordic countries a greater sense of security that makes them more supportive of technological innovations than workers in the United States. The internet monopolies have neither the will nor the inclination to protect society against the consequences of their actions. That turns them into a menace, and it falls to the regulatory authorities to protect society against them. In the United States, the regulators are not strong enough to stand up their political influence. The European Union is better situated because it doesn't have any platform giants of its own. The EU uses a different definition of monopoly power from the United States. US law enforcement focuses primarily on monopolies created by acquisitions, whereas EU law protects the abuse of monopoly power irrespective of how it is achieved. Europe has much stronger privacy and data protection laws than America. Moreover, US law has adopted a strange doctrine. It measures harm as an increase in the price paid by consumers for services rendered. And that's almost impossible to prove when most services are provided for free. This leaves out of consideration the valuable data that platform companies collect from their users. Commissioner Vestager is the champion of the European approach. It took the EU 7 years to build a case against Google, but as a result of her success, the process has been greatly accelerated. Due to her proselytizing, the European approach has begun to affect attitudes in the United States as well. I have mentioned several of the most pressing and important problems confronting us today. In conclusion, let me point out that we are living in a revolutionary period. All our established institutions are in a state of flux, and in these circumstances, both fallibility and reflexivity are operating at full force. I lived through similar conditions in my life, most recently some 30 years ago. That's when I set up my network of foundations in the former Soviet Empire. The main difference between the two periods is that 30 years ago, the dominant creed was international governance and cooperation. The European Union was the rising power, and the Soviet Union the declining one. Today, however, the motivating force is nationalism. Russia is resurgent, and the European Union is in danger of abandoning its values. As you will recall, the previous experience didn't turn out well for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Empire collapsed, and Russia has become a mafia state that has adopted a nationalist ideology. My foundations did quite well. The more advanced members of the Soviet Empire joined the European Union. Now our aim is to help save the European Union in order to radically reinvent it. The EU used to enjoy the enthusiastic support of the people of my generation, but all that changed after the financial crisis of 2008. The EU lost its way because it was governed by outdated treaties and a mistaken belief in austerity policies. What has been a voluntary association of equal states was converted into a relationship between creditors and debtors, where the debtors couldn't meet their obligations and the creditors set the conditions that the debtors had to meet. That association was neither voluntary nor equal. As a consequence, a large proportion of the current generation has come to regard the European Union as its enemy. One important country, Britain, is in the process of leaving the EU, and at least two countries, Poland and Hungary, are ruled by governments that are adamantly opposed to the values on which the European Union was based. There is an acute conflict with various European institutions, and those institutions are trying to discipline them. In several other countries, anti-European parties are on the rise. In Austria, they are in the government coalition, and the fate of Italy will be decided by the elections in March, which is just around the corner. How to prevent the European Union from abandoning its values? We need to reform it at every level. At the level of the Union itself, at the level of the member states, and the level of the electorate. We are, as I said, in a revolutionary period. Everything is subject to change. The decisions taken now will define the shape of the future in Europe. At the Union level, the main question is what to do about the euro. Should every member state be required to eventually adopt the euro, or should the current situation be allowed to continue indefinitely? The Maastricht Treaty prescribed the first alternative, but the euro has developed some defects that the Maastricht Treaty didn't foresee, and they still await resolution. Should the problems of the euro be allowed to endanger the future of the European Union, I would strongly argue against it. The fact is that the countries that don't qualify are eager to join the euro, but those that do have decided against it, with the exception of Bulgaria, which is expected to join this year. In addition, I should like to see Britain remain a member of the EU or eventually rejoin it. And that couldn't happen if it meant adopting the euro. The choice confronting the EU could be better formulated as one between a multi-speed and a multi-track approach. In a multi-speed approach, member states have to agree in advance on the ultimate outcome. In a multi-track approach, member states are free to form coalitions of the willing to pursue particular goals on which they agree. The multi-track approach is obviously more flexible, but the European bureaucracy favored the multi-speed approach. That was an important contributor to the rigidity of the European Union structure. At the level of the member states, their political parties are largely outdated. The old distinction between left and right is overshadowed by being either pro or anti-European. This manifests itself differently in different countries. In Germany, the Siamese twin arrangement between the CDU and the CSU has been rendered unsustainable by the results of the recent elections. There is another party, the AfD, that is further to the right than the CSU in Bavaria. This has forced the CSU to move further to the right in order to compete with the AfD in next year's local elections in Bavaria, so that the gap between the CSU and the CDU has become too great. This has rendered the German party system largely dysfunctional until the CDU and the CSU break up. In Britain, the Conservatives are clearly the party of the right and Labour the party of the left. But each party is internally divided in its attitude towards Brexit. This complicates the Brexit negotiations immensely and makes it extremely difficult for Britain as a country to decide its position towards Europe and to modify it if it wants to. Other European countries can be expected to undergo similar realignments, with the exception of France, which has already undergone its internal revolution. At the level of the electorate, the top-down initiative started by a small group of visionaries led by Jean Monnet carried the process of integration a long way, but it has lost momentum. Now we have a combination, we need a combination of the top-down approach of the European authorities with the bottom-up initiatives started by an engaged electorate. Fortunately, there are many such bottom-up initiatives. It remains to be seen how the authorities will respond to them. So far, President Macron has shown himself most responsive. He campaigned for the French presidency on a pro-European platform, and his current strategy focuses on the elections for the European Parliament in 2019, and that requires engaging the electorate. While I have analyzed Europe in greater detail, from a historical perspective, what happens in Asia is ultimately much more important. China is the rising power. There were many fervent believers in the open society in China who were sent to be re-educated in rural areas during Mao's revolution. Those who survived returned to occupied position of power in the government. So the future the future direction of China used to be open-ended, but no more. The promoters of open society have reached retirement age, and Xi Jinping, who has more in common with Putin than with the so-called West, has begun to establish a new system of party patronage. I'm afraid that the outlook for the next 20 years is rather bleak. Nevertheless, it's important to embed China in institutions of global governance, because this may help to avoid a world war that would destroy our civilization. That leaves the local battlegrounds in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. My foundations are actively engaged in all of them. We are particularly focused on Africa, where would-be dictators in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have perpetrated electoral fraud on an unprecedented scale, and citizens are literally risking their lives to resist the slide into dictatorship. Our goal is to empower local people to deal with their own problems, and particularly the AU, the African Union, to become more important. Then also to assist the disadvantaged and to reduce human suffering to the greatest possible extent. This will give us plenty to do well beyond my lifetime. So let me end on this positive note and invite your questions. Thank you.
Okay, let me just say first, if you have not received the text of George's remarks, let me know. You can send me an email at m@soros.com, and I'll make sure you get them. So there are a lot of questions, George, on migration. But let's talk first about a topic that was probably the most asked. You were pretty hard on Facebook and Google. What solutions might you propose, and how should these companies be regulated?
Well, I don't propose to be an expert on the subject. I think it's a very complicated issue. It requires the full-time attention of those who formulate the new laws and the enforcement of those laws. I've put my faith in them, and particularly on Commissioner Vestager, who has done the most in the last 7 years to enforce the laws and to won an award against Google. And that's only the opening.
technical difficulty here for a moment.
The internet didn't like you.
Hold on.
So I have a question. Why you invest in social media companies?
Sorry, we're gonna take another question here. You have a passionate advocate of reform of Europe's refugees and migration policy. Why is this issue so important to you?
Because I was a refugee myself after the Second World War, when I made my way to Britain. And I must say, I was much better treated than refugees today. But I have maintained, and the foundations have taken an interest in the refugee issue since they started.
And so then there's a follow-up on the migration issue. The EU is spending a lot of money on a compact with the African Union. Do you endorse that? Is that money well spent?
Well, I certainly endorse having compacts with the African states. It's very important, and actually the amount of money that is devoted to it is not sufficient. It needs to be much larger, and it must come from the European Union itself, not from the member states, because the refugee problem is a European problem, and it needs a European solution. And the European Union is has very large uncommitted borrowing power, which is very cheap currently, and it ought to be used. We estimate that you would need at least 30 billion euros a year for a number of years to make to devote to the development, democratic development in Africa, so that the supply of migrants should diminish. But there are two ways of reducing the supply. One is to encourage them to find jobs at home, and the other is to make dirty deals with dictators who then are willing to prohibit people from leaving. And I think currently far too much money is spent on the dirty deals and not enough on democratic development in the African countries.
And then, one final question on migration. What about the Middle East? Because you've talked a lot about Europe, but most of the refugees are in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a very, very important, but it has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. We have focused on Jordan, which has a very large number of refugees and has really treated them very well. The European Union has opened up its market to Jordan exports, but didn't provide sufficient advice on how to develop products and how to sell those products in Europe. As a result, exports to Europe have not increased, while the US, which has concluded a similar deal earlier, is importing very large amounts of particularly clothing from Jordan. So more could be done, and I think we as a foundation have made Jordan our top priority because it has the potential of solving its problems and distinguishing itself from its neighborhood, which has become redlined by investors. And they are developing EU e-governance with the help of Estonia, which has been a world leader in this field. So we have great hopes of demonstrating success because all the ingredients are there.
So somebody says, you're a currency speculator. What do you think of cryptocurrencies? Is Bitcoin a bubble? And do you have a position in cryptocurrencies?
Well, cryptocurrency is a misnomer, and it's a typical bubble which is always based on some kind of misunderstanding. The Bitcoin is not a currency, because a currency is supposed to be a stable store of value, and a currency that can fluctuate 25% in a day can't be used, for instance, to pay wages, because the wages could drop by 25% in a day. So it's a speculation. It's based on a misunderstanding. There is also a very innovative blockchain technology which can be used for positive or negative purposes. Currently, it's used mostly for tax evasion and the let's say for people in the rulers in dictatorships to build a nest egg abroad. So recently there was just now a conference, a Valdai conference, where instead of discussing conditions in Russia, they mainly discussed Bitcoin, because that's what the rulers were interested in. So this will have a big effect on the valuation of Bitcoin. Normally, when you have a parabolic curve, eventually it has a very sharp break. But in this case, I think as long as that you have got dictatorships on the rise, you will have a different ending, because the rulers in those countries are going to turn to Bitcoin to build a nest egg abroad. So I expect, instead of an abrupt break, to have a rather flat top over, but it's nevertheless a bubble, typical, which is always based on a misunderstanding, like the tulip mania. But the blockchain technology can be put to positive use, and we use it actually in helping migrants to communicate with their families and to keep their money safe and carry it with them, with themselves.
So, speaking of dictators, there are a couple of questions around Hungary, and I would combine these to say, essentially, what do you make of the Orban government's attack on you?
Well, I mentioned it briefly that people, dictators who are successful tend to overstep the mark and make themselves vulnerable for a counterattack. And let me explain how the situation in Hungary. Orban has based his re-election campaign on demonizing me. And he conducted a national inquiry which attributed to me 7 actions or statements which I showed to be false. And actually, the Hungarian court, or appellate court, forbade Orban to use that questionnaire. But by that time, the inquiry had concluded, so the Hungarian public never heard about that decision. Unfortunately, Orban has been very successful in making the mafia state work efficiently. He is actually bought up physically, financially, the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, and he has got spies in every emerging clean government party that could attract the electorate. So it's extremely difficult for them to combine and pass the quota that's necessary to be elected. So I'm afraid that in spite of all these things, he's liable to win re-election.
On that, George, are you done? Do you want to take one more question, or?
Well, that's fun. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. There's a question about Burma or Myanmar. What is your take on the treatment of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar and the latest mass exodus to Bangladesh?
This is an issue that I am very, very much engaged in. I went to Sitwe, the capital of Rakhine State, 3 years ago, and I met the professional and commercial Rohingya elite in a ghetto in Sitwe. And I said to them, I'm a Rohingya, and I meant it, because their condition reminded me of the ghetto in Budapest during the war. And I have taken a personal interest in their fate, and it's terrible. I mean, it's whether it's genocide or crimes against humanity is for the experts to decide. But it is currently going on because there is an effort to repatriate an agreement sponsored by China between Myanmar and Bangladesh to repatriate the Rohingya. But they refuse to go because they don't trust, that's not why they ran away. So they refuse to go, and the repatriation has to be on the basis of voluntary repatriation. But what is happening right now is a continuation of the process which started in the last 6 months. And the responsibility, the primary responsibility, is with the military. The general public, the world community is genuinely outraged, and rightly. But they are criticizing Aung San Suu Kyi. And while she has made her own mistakes, I don't fully excuse her. She has no power in the Rakhine state because it's entirely in the hands of the military. And so the responsibility is with the military, and the sanctions should be directed at the military, and they should be also prosecuted under the International Criminal Court.
Okay, I think with that we will call it a night. And thanks, George. Thanks very much.
Sorry, everybody. Dessert course will be served now, so you can remain seated. We're going to serve dessert. Thank you for your patience while dinner is being removed.